America has always had its unknowns. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is, in many ways, the country's most honest monument. It acknowledges, in white marble and military ceremony, and the careful phrasing of "known but to God," that there are limits to what we can know about the people who die in the service and in the course of history. For soldiers, we built a monument. For civilians, we built a database. But the database came late. It came after decades of the problem accumulating in the basements of county medical examiners' offices, in the overwhelmed filing systems of understaffed police departments, in the gaps between systems that had been built without ever imagining they would need to talk to each other. Before we can understand where forensic genetic genealogy is taking us, we need to understand where we came from. We need to understand the long history of unidentified America, the ways in which the country's systems for dealing with the dead have evolved, the ways in which they have failed, and the reasons why, as of 2025, there are still more than 14,000 unidentified persons in the national database. The challenge of identifying the dead is as old as civilization itself. In ancient Egypt, the careful preservation of bodies was itself a form of identity. The belief that the individual's eternal soul required the specific physical form it had inhabited in life. The mummified body with its face intact, its name inscribed in hieroglyphs on the burial wrappings, represented one of the earliest systematic attempts to maintain a connection between a person and their physical remains across the boundary of death. In ancient Rome, military commanders kept records of their soldiers specifically so that the fallen could be identified. Dog tags in their earliest form were scratched onto lead plates and hung around soldiers' necks, not for the soldiers' benefit, but for the army's administrative record-keeping. The modern problem of unidentified dead, however, is distinctly a product of modernity. The American Civil War produced, in the 4 years between 1861 and 1865, a catastrophe of unidentified remains that would not be replicated in scale until the Second World War. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, and a significant percentage of them were never identified. The reasons were practical. The scale of the fighting exceeded the capacity of any record-keeping system. Men died by the thousands in single engagements. The conditions for recovery and identification were chaotic, dangerous, and often impossible. Families who lost sons or husbands or brothers had no systematic way to search for them. The result was a national wound. Families who never knew what happened to their men, communities that grieved without the closure of a body or a grave. Clara Barton, who would go on to found the American Red Cross, established one of the earliest systematic programs for identifying missing soldiers after the Civil War, a precursor in spirit, if not in technology, to what NamUs would eventually become. The Civil War created something we'd never had before in America, a systematic problem of unidentified dead on a massive scale. How did that experience shape the way the country thought about its obligations to the fallen? The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the gradual development of the forensic sciences, the study of physical evidence as a tool for legal investigations. Most of this work was focused on the living or on recent deaths. The identification of criminals through fingerprints, the development of toxicology, the beginnings of forensic pathology. The systematic identification of unidentified human remains was a slower development, driven less by scientific advances than by the pragmatic demands of a society that was becoming increasingly mobile, increasingly anonymous, and increasingly capable of dying far from anyone who knew them. Fingerprinting, developed in the late 19th century and systematized by Francis Galton and Edward Henry, among others, offered the first truly systematic tool for personal identification. The theory was elegant. No two people have the same fingerprints. The patterns are consistent throughout life, and they can be recorded and compared across vast databases. The FBI's fingerprint database, established in the 1920s, became the foundation of the American forensic identification system. When a body was found, fingerprints were taken if possible. Those prints were run against the database. If a match was found, the case was closed. If no match was found, because the person had never been fingerprinted, the body remained unidentified. The limitation was built into the design. The database was only as useful as its coverage, and its coverage was, by definition, limited to people who had come into prior contact with the criminal justice system or certain government programs that collected fingerprints. The vast majority of Americans had never been fingerprinted. Dental records offered a parallel system, one that was arguably more broadly applicable, since most Americans had dentists and therefore had dental records that could theoretically be compared to the teeth of an unidentified body. The problem was not the theory. The problem was the practice. To match dental records, you need to know which dental records to look for. You need to have a lead, a name, a region, a time period that allows you to narrow the field. A body found on a cliff road in Marin County in 1966 gives you nothing to work with. No name, no hometown, no reason to contact any specific dentist anywhere on the continent. Unless someone is reported missing, unless a family says, "We are looking for this person, please compare your records." Dental records are useless. And in Dorothy Jean Williams's case, no one was looking. There is a concept in the study of unidentified persons that experts sometimes call the missing. It refers not to unidentified bodies, those are the found dead without names, but to the larger category of people who have disappeared and for whom no missing persons report has ever been filed. The number of such people is, by definition, impossible to know precisely. But researchers who study this area consistently find that the missing are heavily concentrated in specific demographic groups: the homeless, the undocumented, the estranged, the mentally ill, the elderly without family, the poor without community. People, in other words, for whom the social safety net was missing, who fell through all the gaps, not just one. Who are the people most likely to die without being reported missing? What does that tell us about the relationship between social vulnerability and the likelihood of ending up in the unidentified persons database? A 2022 study published in the journal Forensic Science International examined the demographics of the NameUse database in detail. The findings were troubling but not surprising. The unidentified dead are disproportionately drawn from vulnerable populations, people experiencing homelessness, people with substance use disorders, people with mental illness, people who were, for whatever reason, living outside the social networks that would typically generate a missing persons report. They are also, the study found, disproportionately from communities that have historically had fraught relationships with law enforcement. Communities where the instinct to call the police when someone goes missing is not universal or automatic. This creates what researchers have called a double jeopardy of invisibility. The people most likely to end up in the unidentified person system are also the people least likely to be reported missing, which means the database entry that would allow a match, the missing persons report, is often never created. The history of unidentified America is, in significant part, a history of which lives the systems were built to track, and which lives fell outside those systems. For most of American history, the answer was clear. The systems were built around the documented, the employed, the propertied, and the enfranchised. The people who fell outside those categories, the migrant workers, the immigrants, the homeless, the mentally ill, fell outside the systems as well. The development of NameUse represented an important step toward changing this. By creating a national searchable database of both missing persons and unidentified remains, and by making that database accessible to the public as well as to law enforcement, NameUse dramatically expanded the possibility of making connections across jurisdictional lines and across demographic categories. But NameUse is only as good as the information entered into it. cases that were closed before NamUs existed, or were never properly documented in the first place, remain invisible. Dorothy Jean Williams's case was in NamUs, but it sat there for nearly 2 decades before the technology existed to do something about it. The story of DNA in forensic science is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable stories in the history of both science and law enforcement. It begins with a murder, 2 murders actually, in the English Midlands in 1983 and 1986, and with a scientist named Alec Jeffreys, who, one autumn morning in his laboratory at the University of Leicester, was looking at an X-ray image and had one of those moments that scientists call a eureka and that everyone else calls a miracle. Alec Jeffreys had been studying the structure of a particular protein involved in muscle disease. He had developed a technique for producing X-ray images of DNA fragments, images that showed as patterns of light and dark bands on a film, the locations where specific sequences of DNA occurred in a given sample. On the morning of September 10, 1984, Jeffreys looked at an X-ray image that showed the DNA patterns of several members of a laboratory technician's family, and he saw something he hadn't expected. The patterns were unique to each individual, not slightly different, not somewhat different, completely, unmistakably unique, as individual as a fingerprint, as personal as a face. Jeffreys called what he had discovered DNA fingerprinting. It would later be known as DNA profiling or DNA typing, and it would become the most powerful tool in the history of forensic science. When Jeffreys made this discovery, what did it actually mean for forensics? What became possible that had been impossible before? The first criminal cases to use DNA evidence came in 1986 in the very English Midlands where Jeffreys had made his discovery. A young man named Richard Buckland had confessed to the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl named Dawn Ashworth in Narborough, Leicestershire. He was the local police's prime suspect. A confession had been obtained. The prosecutor decided to use the new DNA testing to confirm Buckland's guilt before trial. The DNA didn't match. Buckland was innocent. His confession, obtained under the kind of pressure that it would eventually become clear could produce false confessions, had been wrong. It was the first time DNA evidence had exonerated an innocent person. The same DNA evidence that exonerated Buckland was then used through a mass screening of more than 4,000 local men to identify the actual killer, a young man named Colin Pitchfork, who had persuaded a friend to give a blood sample in his place. When investigators were tipped off about the substitution and obtained Pitchfork's actual DNA, it matched the evidence. Pitchfork was convicted in 1988. He was the first person in the world to be convicted of a crime based on DNA evidence. The age of DNA forensics had begun. In the United States, the development of DNA forensics moved quickly through the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Federal Bureau of Investigation established its DNA database program, which would eventually become CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS was built around a specific type of DNA analysis called STR profiling, short tandem repeat profiling. STRs are regions of the genome where a short sequence of DNA is repeated multiple times, and the number of repetitions varies between individuals. By checking the number of repeats at a set of specific locations in the genome, initially 13, later expanded to 20, investigators could build a DNA profile that was unique to an individual, with a probability of a random match measured in the billions or trillions to 1. CODIS became enormously powerful. By 2023, the database contained DNA profiles from more than 18 million individuals, primarily convicted felons and, in many states, arrestees, along with forensic profiles from crime scenes. It has been used to identify suspects and solve cases in hundreds of thousands of investigations. But it has a fundamental limitation. CODIS can only match a profile to someone already in CODIS. What is CODIS excellent at, and what are its limitations? What percentage of forensic DNA samples from crime scenes are actually resolved through a CODIS hit? For many categories of cases, CODIS works extraordinarily well. When a crime is committed by someone who has previously been arrested or convicted, the probability of a CODIS match is high. When a crime is committed by a first-time offender, or by someone who has managed to avoid criminal records, CODIS returns nothing. For unidentified persons cases, the calculus is different. The question isn't whether the unidentified person committed a crime. The question is who they are, and for that question, CODIS is limited to identifying people whose DNA was already in the database before they died, a relatively small fraction of the population. Dorothy Jean Williams's DNA was not in CODIS. She had never been arrested. She had never been processed through a system that would have collected her DNA. The CODIS approach was not going to help her. What she needed was something different. The next revolution in forensic DNA technology came from an unexpected direction, not from law enforcement, but from the living rooms and mailboxes of ordinary Americans. In 2006, a company called 23andMe launched the first direct-to-consumer genetic testing service. For a fee, initially several $100s, eventually dropping below $100, you could send in a saliva sample and receive, a few weeks later, a detailed analysis of your genetic heritage, your ethnic origins, your risk factors for certain diseases, and perhaps most compelling for many customers, your genetic relatives. Other companies followed. Ancestry.com, which already had a vast genealogical database, added genetic testing to its platform. MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and others entered the market. By the mid-2000s, direct-to-consumer genetic testing had become a cultural phenomenon. By 2024, an estimated 1 in 5 Americans had taken some form of consumer DNA test. More than 14 million people had tested with 23andMe alone. Ancestry's DNA database had surpassed 20 million individuals. GED Match, a free platform that allowed users to upload DNA data from any testing company for cross-platform comparison, had more than 1 million profiles. The aggregate genetic database of voluntary DNA testing had become, almost inadvertently, one of the most powerful tools for identifying individuals that the world had ever seen. Law enforcement was paying attention. The gap between forensic DNA analysis and genealogical DNA databases is not, technically, very large. Both systems work with DNA profiles. Both systems look for matches between profiles. The technical difference is the type of DNA analysis used. Forensic STR profiling, as used in CODIS, and genomic SNP profiling, as used in consumer DNA testing, analyze different parts of the genome in different ways, and the two types of profiles are not directly compatible. But the underlying insight is the same. DNA is shared between relatives. If you can find relatives in a database, you can build a family tree. If you can build a family tree, you can find the person you're looking for. I know you might be wondering the difference between STR profiling, as used in CODIS, and SNP profiling, as used in genealogy databases, and saying, why can't you just use one system for everything? The bridge between these two worlds was built in the mid-2000s by a handful of scientists and genealogists who saw the potential of consumer DNA databases for forensic applications. One of the earliest and most important of these pioneers is Barbara Ray Venter, a retired patent attorney who had become a certified genetic genealogist in her second career. Working initially with the DNA Doe Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to identifying Jane and John Doe cases, Ray Venter developed the methodological framework that would eventually change everything. The approach she pioneered was elegantly straightforward. Take a forensic DNA sample, sequence it for SNPs rather than STRs, upload the resulting profile to a consumer DNA database like GEDmatch, and use the relative matches found there as the starting point for genealogical research that would eventually lead to the identity of the unknown person. It worked. When did you first realize this approach was going to work? That you could take an unknown person's DNA and actually identify them through genealogical research? What did that moment feel like? The DNA Doe Project was founded in 2017 by Margaret Press and Doc Edge, with the specific mission of using forensic genetic genealogy to identify unidentified persons, the Jane Does and John Does, who sat in Namus without names. The project took an explicit decision to focus on the identification of victims rather than the identification of suspects. This distinction would prove important, both practically and ethically, as the technology spread. Working entirely with volunteers, certified genetic genealogists who donated their time and expertise, the DNA Doe Project began working through the Namus backlog case by case. The results were remarkable. Cases that had been cold for decades were resolved in weeks or months. Among the DNA Doe Project's cases, Buckskin Girl, a Jane Doe found in Ohio in 1981, who was identified in 2018 as Marcia Lenore King. Lisa Jensen, whose identification led to the unraveling of the Bear Brook murders, a case we will explore in depth in the next episode. Case after case after case. The bridge was built. The science was working. All it needed was to be brought to scale. Before we leave this history and move forward, there is one more dimension of the story of unidentified America that deserves attention. The pre-Namus landscape was not simply a vacuum. It was a collection of local and state systems that had been built by individual counties and states over decades, each with its own logic, its own formats, its own ways of storing and retrieving information. The fundamental problem was not that no one cared. Many individual investigators, medical examiners, detectives, forensic anthropologists cared deeply about the unidentified in their jurisdictions. The problem was that the systems didn't talk to each other. A missing persons report filed in California had no automatic pathway to a Jane Doe case file in Ohio. An unidentified body found in Florida had no automatic connection to the missing persons database in Texas. The information existed. The connections did not. Before Namus, what was the experience like for investigators who were trying to make connections between unidentified remains and missing persons reports? What were the barriers? Namus changed some of this. The creation of a national, publicly accessible database meant that family members could now search for potential matches between their missing person and the unidentified remains in the database. Investigators in different jurisdictions could see each other's work. The information could flow, but Namus didn't change the fundamental constraint. In cases where the evidence was too degraded for conventional testing, or where no missing persons report had ever been filed, the database returned nothing. The revolution that forensic genetic genealogy represents is the revolution of last resort. It is the tool that works when everything else has failed. It is the reason that a woman who died on a California cliff road in 1966 can be identified in 2025. It is why Dorothy Jean Williams has a name.